Hi, I'm Daniel Zwerdling.
Hi, I'm David Shipler. Two reporters start now.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. We're going to find out, how did Adolf Hitler transform Germany into the kind of country he wanted? How did he transform the way ordinary Germans saw and felt about their country?
Our guest today has spent much of her life studying how Hitler transformed universities and schools and museums and theaters and art galleries. She's just about to retire from her career as history professor at the University of Northern Colorado. Joan Clinefelter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here.
And when Dave said you're about to retire, you broke into a huge grin.
I have 5 more classes, and that's all I have left, and no final exams. So I'm super excited.
Well, we know you're a super gifted professor, but I guess even gifted professors want to relax someday.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we've been hearing even well-known Americans say just recently that Donald Trump is acting like Hitler. Former Vice President Al Gore compared them just recently. We should stress to our listeners that we're not going to be talking about the horrific parts of Hitler and the Nazis that most Americans know and hear about, which is their mass murder campaigns and the concentration camps. We're going to focus on how they try to take over the German mindset. But before we get there, we need to understand Adolf Hitler in more detail. When he first came to power, what were his broad goals, and then what were some of the first steps he took to implement them?
Well, Hitler was never vague about what he intended to do. He made it very clear right from the 1920s that he intended to overthrow democracy by using the tools of democracy in order to do that.
This is very interesting because what you're saying is that the Nazis never adopted the facade of democracy. They actually denounced democracy. There was no deception there about, how we're really making it a true democracy or anything of that sort.
Yeah. In fact, Hitler is put on trial for treason after his attempt to overthrow the government in 1923. And he says during the trial very clearly that he intends to overthrow democracy by using the tools of democracy. So by the end of 1932, Hitler had decided that he needed to make common cause with the conservative political party in Germany. And they helped him get named Chancellor of Germany by the president. And Hitler and the conservatives used this as an opportunity to essentially suspend civil rights inside of Germany, and they were never, ever restored. They did this by having the president pass the law for the law for the protection of the people and state. And this law made it possible for phones to be tapped, mail to be read, houses to be searched without any warrant. People could be arrested without any warrant, held indefinitely. This is when they begin to build the concentration camps. And again, essentially, it abolished all civil rights inside of Germany.
And what year was that?
This is in February of 1933.
Joan, going back to what we said at the top about Hitler wanted to change the way people thought. What did he want to do to transform?
He envisioned a Germany that would no longer have any other political parties but the Nazi Party, and that the political left and the unions would be smashed, would be destroyed. And he had this concept of a national community. And the so-called national community was supposed to be racially pure, and class differences would no longer matter. So he wanted to bring the entire nation together behind his leadership and embark on this great and glorious future that would unite the country, solve all problems, purge culture, purge the arts, and make Germany ideologically uniform so that everybody would believe the very same thing and they would all work together.
And we have a clip here of Hitler. This was at the Nazi Party Congress in 1934.
Das deutsche Volk ist glücklich in dem Bewusstsein, dass die ewige Flucht der Erscheinungen nunmehr endgültig abgelöst wurde.
So to translate, the German people are happy in the knowledge that the eternal flight of appearances has now been replaced by one stable pole. And they sense and know that the very best German blood has risen to the leadership of the nation, and it is determined to keep this leadership and to exercise it and to never give it up again. What we hear here is Hitler referring to the German blood, and that this is going to be now a racial country, meaning that anybody who is not of the German race is excluded from this national community. That would include Jews, communists, socialists, political opponents. Really, anybody who is against the regime is coded as not really being German. And Hitler is planning to go to war. He made this very clear in Mein Kampf, which he published in 1924, so long before he came to power. And he envisioned Germany conquering Europe and transforming, in particular, Eastern Europe into a German colony, where the local populations would be either eliminated entirely or subjugated to complete German control. That's really his big vision.
So you're saying, Joan, that he was very explicit about all this, at least in Mein Kampf, his manifesto, and the Germans should have had no illusions if they read it. But how about later in speeches once he's gaining political power?
The one thing he was not explicit about in any speeches is this idea of going to war. Hitler represented himself as a man of peace, both domestically and internationally, and that view was largely accepted. The German people were really hungering for some sort of leadership. They wanted to overcome the national disgrace of losing World War I, and they wanted their national identity, their national pride to be restored. And they thought that Hitler was leading them to a better place. And in fact, if one was not communist, not socialist, not Jewish, for most Germans, life did improve, at least before the war broke out.
So let's talk about some of the areas in which he sought transformation. History and the teaching of history is one that's always fascinating in every country, including ours. We just did an interview with two Israeli scholars about how history is taught in Israel. I don't suppose it's ever pure, but in this case, he really set out to manipulate its representation extensively, didn't he? Hitler did.
Absolutely. This process really starts with the purge of the civil service, which included all university professors and also all teachers as well. And this was a law passed in April 1933. The Nazis always gave their laws really nice names. So this was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service.
Professional civil service. I would support that based on its name.
You're an easy mark.
And anybody who was communist, socialist, Jewish, politically suspect was purged from the civil service. And then those purged positions were then filled with Nazi party members or true believers.
When you say purged, were they fired, imprisoned, laid off?
They were fired. They were either allowed to retire or they were simply fired. And this made it possible then for the Nazis to take over the teaching profession. They had already prepared for this by creating a Nazi teachers union. And by the mid-1930s, about 97% of teachers belonged to this Nazi teachers union. And they offered special classes for how to change the curriculum, which was particularly important because for the first several years, they're still using the old textbooks because the new textbooks haven't come out yet. And so they wanted to make sure that the teaching profession understood how history should actually be taught.
And before we get to the content of their version of history, I just want to mention that part of this whole transformation was urging fellow faculty members and others to denounce, to report, right? To report professors who they thought weren't towing the line and were teaching, impure history.
Right. And not only colleagues were encouraged to denounce each other, but students were encouraged to denounce their professors as well. And the Nazis had a Of course, they had Hitler Youth, which was for children aged 10 and up. They also had a Nazi university students organization. And the Nazi student organization at universities were routinely advised to go into classes and make sure that this professor, who they suspected of being, in one case, too pro-Catholic, and then to report on what the students had learned so that this individual could then be fired.
This is very interesting because I lived in the Soviet Union for 4 years, covering it for the New York Times, and I saw there that authority was transmitted horizontally as well as vertically, and it's just the same way. I mean, there were informants, denunciations. People understood where the boundaries were. They didn't have to be told from on high all the time.
In fact, the Gestapo really relied on denunciations. We often think of the Gestapo, the secret police in Germany, as having an extensive network. There were really only 16,000 Gestapo agents.
Really?
And that's for a population of like 63 million. You know, the East German Stasi, their secret police, had something on the order of 200,000 agents.
Yikes.
So much more extensive than what the Nazis ever had. So the Nazis really do rely on denunciations of friends and neighbors and colleagues in order to root out anybody who was potentially against the regime.
Were the Nazi students and the Nazi teachers organizations selective, or could anybody join?
Pretty much anybody could join. I mean, of course, you couldn't be communist, socialist, or Jewish.
Yeah. So basically, it was up to you
Yeah.
to choose willingly to participate in that kind of organization and therefore the enforcement mechanism?
Yeah. And if you didn't choose, you would not advance in your career. And of course, you were at risk of being fired at any time.
And I guess this helps explain to some extent why some people who you think, gee, I thought he or she, they were good people, why they would participate in this, because seeing somebody you work with denounce maybe gives you the opportunity to fill his or her position, right?
Oh, yes.
And whether you're a faculty member or a student, you can benefit from other people's trouble.
Absolutely. And a lot of the teachers that the Nazis end up hiring, they weren't necessarily Nazi Party members, but they were often young teachers, people who had had trouble finding jobs, particularly during the Great Depression. So here was a real opportunity to sort of jump into the profession, feel that they were part of this national revival, and to help revitalize education.
So then there's the matter of the curriculum.
Yes.
You said that the teachers were even taught how to teach history before the books were all revised. So what was the new history? What did Hitler and the Nazis want to purge from German consciousness, and what did they want to take its place instead?
So they wanted history to demonstrate German superiority and the ways that the rest of the Western world had sought to keep Germany divided and weak. For example, they argued that Germany did not lose the First World War. Instead, they were about to defeat France and the Allies on the Western Front. And at the moment, the Germans were poised for victory on the front, which is not true at all. Back home, there was a revolution. And this revolution, according to the Nazis, was launched by communists, socialists, and Jews, and they stabbed Germany in the back. This happened in November of 1918. And so the Nazis referred to these supposed nefarious forces as the November criminals. So the Nazis claimed that this is really the moment that set Germany on this false path on democracy, which the Nazis always represented as being alien, a trick imposed on Germany from outside forces, again, that wanted to keep Germany divided and weak. So the other real thing that the history courses, and really a lot of the courses in the Third Reich, emphasized was the importance of race, the so-called Aryan or German peoples, and the need for racial purity. So again and again, the emphasis is that great civilizations fall when the dominant country racially mixes with the people that they conquer. So here's a good example. This is from Mein Kampf. Historical experience offers countless proofs that this racial purity is vital. It shows with terrifying clarity that in every mingling of Aryan blood with that of lower peoples, the result was the end of a cultured people. All great cultures of the past perish only because the originally creative race died out from blood poisoning.
Mm-hmm. Well, did this come out of nowhere, Joan, or did this have antecedents before the Nazis, this concept of racial purity?
Oh, it definitely has concepts beforehand. In the mid 1800s, there's a great deal of discussion about race mixing. So that definitely had a longer antecedent. The Nazis don't really come up with much that's original at all. But Hitler really latches on to this as a way to make a claim that Germany has to restore its greatness. And he saw the idea of race as a way to bind the country together so that racial identity could replace class identity, religious identity, local identities. So the question was not, are you a Berliner? Are you a Catholic? Are you a member of the Conservative Party? The question is, are you first and foremost German? And the way that you proved that you were German was, did you feel yourself to be German and not Jewish?
And I take it the one thing the curriculum had to change was expunge any idea that Jews and communists and others had contributed to German society and art and culture. In fact, I've read that they banned discussing Einstein. Is that right? Because he was Jewish.
Yes, and they regarded Einstein's variety of physics as a Jewish science. Ultimately, this ended up delaying the Nazis' ability to develop the nuclear bomb, so that might be a good thing. But yeah, any Jewish intellectual or professor was purged. Literature by Jews was also banned, even destroyed in huge bonfires, burning books, which was happening by May of 1933. So again, very, very early in the regime.
And I understand that Hitler was portrayed in all of these histories and in the books as the figure of German society, the savior, the heroic, selfless leader who will save Germany from all its enemies, right? It was very much about Hitler, Hitler, Hitler.
Oh, very much so. Even elementary school texts had illustrations of Hitler. One of the most common stories for elementary school teachers was Hitler as a little boy, supposedly loving history classes. He's living in Austria at the time, and he doesn't understand why Austria and Germany are not the same country. Even as a child, Hitler looks forward to this day where all the German people are living together in the same German Reich, which of course happens in 1938 when the Nazis take over Austria. Let me read you a couple of excerpts. These are guidelines for the teaching of history in secondary schools. This is from 1938. Let's see. A new understanding of the German past has emerged from the faith of the National Socialist movement in the future of the German people. The teaching of history must come from this vital faith. It must fill young people with the awareness that they belong to a nation which of all the European nations had the longest and most difficult path to its unification, but now, at the beginning of a new epoch, can look forward to what is coming confidence. Here's the last line. The powerless and insignificant have no history.
Well, that suggests that the blemishes in German history, which exist in all countries, were erased. Is that the case?
Yes. A wholly positive version of Germany is presented in history.
Obviously, as you said, Joan, the purpose of this history curriculum that's being introduced in the Nazi student associations and the Nazi teachers associations and all of that is to create that unity and have a single-minded approach to the facts and the past and the present and the future. So I guess the question in my mind is, when I'm thinking about schools and textbooks, how is this implemented, actually? I mean, what happened in the classrooms?
Basically, it's implemented by the teachers. The Nazis had replaced any teachers who were likely to resist. The teachers actually attend these special camps where they're given the new curriculum, they're given materials to teach, and in that way, they can start implementing the new curriculum before they even have the new textbooks. So the teachers are given all kinds of guidelines, and the teachers typically feel that they are part of this much larger movement. This is also a real important aspect of the Third Reich. those who supported it, and the mass of Germans supported the Nazis. They really feel that they're kind of on this upward swing and that they're all coming together in ways that they had never been able to experience before.
So there was a fervor, a popular fervor.
Oh, absolutely.
Very interesting. What did they do? Just throw away the old textbooks?
And we've heard about the book burnings, the piles of hundreds, thousands of books on fire.
Is it just verbal, or did they have written stuff that they gave the students?
It's verbal, and then they start developing visual materials and written materials as well. From what I understand, they focus first on the elementary education because they want to make sure they can get the very small children before anything else. And I think it's after fourth grade, they also begin teaching boys and girls separately. The boys tend to get readings that emphasize a future with military service, whereas the girls' books really emphasize becoming wives and homemakers and future mothers.
So in the mid-30s, what happened to the Jewish students who were clearly not included in this history in any admirable way?
So there are laws passed. There's a law against the overcrowding of the schools. That's not the official name, but that's pretty close.
The law against the overcrowding of the schools.
Yes. And this law basically says that 5%, no more than 5% of a school's population can be Jewish. This didn't have any effect in a lot of places because in a lot of places in Germany, there were no Jews. Jews are less than 1% of the population. But in large cities like Munich or Berlin, that did begin to take Jews out of the schools. A lot of Jews left willingly because they were being persecuted by the teachers, by their fellow students. And then eventually the Nazis will pass a law that denies Jewish children any right to education.
One of the things that struck me preparing for our chat was that Hitler and the Nazis didn't just go after universities and the whole school system in order to impose their version of Germany on the German people, but they also took control of museums and research centers to make sure that they were in line with what they taught about history.
And they prepare for this also very early on in 1933. They create what's called the Reich Chamber of Culture. This was under Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. And this Reich Chamber of Culture essentially Nazified all of culture and all media. So in order to be involved in art, literature, music, radio, theater, film, and the press, one had to apply for and be accepted as a member in the Reich's Chamber of Culture. This, of course, eliminated communists, socialists, Jews, but also anybody else who is ideologically suspect. Now, of course, any museum director or museum staff, they were public civil servants. And so they had already been purged by the law for the restoration of the civil service. So I think these two laws really work together to completely transform culture and media inside of Germany, again, so that there was only one message that was imposed on the German people.
And what happened to the museums in terms of history, the way history was portrayed?
Yeah, you told me when we chatted on the phone that by maybe the second year of Hitler's takeover, they went after the famous Nuremberg Museum, the German Historical Museum, to make sure it conformed to their vision of teaching history.
Yeah, one of the main things they did there was, of course, their staff had already been purged, was transform exhibitions that had anything to do with World War I. So there had been a World War I exhibition up there. They completely reinterpreted it so that World War I wasn't really lost. And a lot of history was reinterpreted so that the Third Reich was the ultimate culmination of all of German history. One of the best examples of this reinterpretation of history took place in the summer of 1937. This is when they had the two rival exhibitions, the Great German Art Exhibition, which was good art, and the Degenerate Exhibition, which was the bad modernist art.
Yeah, we want to talk about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and Dave and I were sharing that we had never heard about any of this, that the Nazis really believed that art sort of symbolized the German soul and either good art or degenerate art would shape how you thought about yourself and your country.
Yeah, they actually believed that by looking at modern art, so think about an abstract painting, for example, that looking at that literally degraded one's blood and degraded one's cultural and national identity. And it sickened the whole people. This is this idea of degeneration. It literally kind of broke down one's national and racial health. And by looking at a good piece of art, one would be restored to racial national health. One would see that they were part of this great and glorious continuum of German history and tradition, and feel that they were part of this new national community that had been created under the Third Reich.
Can you describe in some detail the degenerate art? You said abstract.
Sure. I can name some leading artists, for example, Vasily Kandinsky.
Oh, Kandinsky was considered a degenerate.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. He was considered degenerate. One of my favorite painters is Franz Marc, who is a friend of Kandinsky's, who painted animals in bright oranges. The bodies of the animals often imitated the landscape.
Pablo Picasso.
Did not like Picasso at all. He was also degenerate. Marc Chagall was degenerate, not only because of the way he painted, but of course he was Jewish as well. So any kind of painting that we now consider to be modernist art, where cows didn't look like cows, trees didn't look like trees, forms were abstracted or they were in colors that were not part of the natural palette, Hitler really wanted a very conservative kind of art form.
Now, Joan, I read in your chapter a really interesting thing about all of this, which I had not known.
And we should say Joan wrote a chapter in a book called, Joan, want to plug the name of the book?
I can't remember the name of the book.
Wait. Yeah, I have the title. Life and Times in Nazi Germany, edited by Lisa Pine, with a chapter by you, Joan Clinefelter.
So, Joan, I read in your chapter there were actually exhibitions of degenerate art.
Oh, yes.
That traveled around Germany, despite the fact that, they believed that looking at these paintings would somehow infect your blood. They wanted to demonstrate this evil thing, right? It seems like a contradiction.
It does seem like a contradiction. In a lot of ways, they wanted this art exhibition, this degenerate art exhibition, which did tour around Germany, from 1937, when it first appeared in Munich, then it goes to Berlin. It hits almost every other major city. It ends up going to Vienna after Germany takes over Austria as well. The whole idea was not just to vilify the art, but to vilify the democracy that had promoted this kind of art and presented it in public museums, to poison the German people. And the Nazis tried their level best to control the public's reception of this art. They had a special guidebook that would take you through a proper understanding of the art. The art was hung on walls with big banners overhead that made clear that, for example, these artworks illustrate the Jewish spirit, or this is sabotaging the German military. These were some of the headings over this art. And then it was exhibited in such a way. Often the works were upside down. Sculptures were just set on the floor.
The galleries were dark, I read, often instead of...
The galleries are dark.
And jammed. The art was jammed together.
Really jammed together.
So it wouldn't be attractive, yeah.
Yeah, so it would be very difficult to leave the exhibition with a positive view of this art.
And what blew my mind was that hundreds of thousands of people would line up to see these degenerate art exhibition.
Yeah, more than 1 million people saw the degenerate exhibition in Munich and in Berlin. Far more people went to the degenerate art exhibition than went to the Great German Art Exhibition.
And why do you think that was?
Well, these exhibits were often presented as a horror show. And I think it was a way for the Germans to come and be reassured that if they did not understand modern art, It wasn't because there was something wrong with them, that they were uneducated. Instead, it was precisely because they were pure Germans that this art didn't speak to them and that they didn't love it. Also, attending the Degenerate Art exhibition was a way to show that one supported the regime and its policies to purify German culture. And I think sometimes, too, there's this desire among human beings to go and see really horrible things, like watching a horror movie. There's some sort of titillating thrill that comes along with that. And we do know that there were some people who went to this exhibit to say goodbye to the art that they really loved. Because they knew that it was disappearing from the public stage.
You know, there's another question that comes to mind as you're talking about the museums and their change in the way history is portrayed, which is that it takes an awful lot of complicity way, way down the line in a population to make something like this work. Just not the guy at the top. When you get down to the level of, say, the curator of a museum who's been in that job for a while, what motivates a person like that? Is it fear? Is the person buying into the whole concept?
So most often, the curators from the democracy are purged, and they're replaced with Nazi Party members, and also with artists who had always painted in this very, very conservative way. This is one of the things that I really focused on in some of my earlier work. Artists who were not part of the avant-garde in the 1920s and always painted in a very realistic kind of style. They felt that their inabilities to succeed in the art market was all part of this Jewish un-German conspiracy.
The Jewish intelligentsia.
Yeah, that relegated them to the economic sidelines of the art market.
Oh, that's interesting. So they felt excluded in a sense or marginalized.
And now
they're getting it back.
They're getting it back.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And there's a lot of retribution going on. And so a lot of these conservative artists end up filling curator positions at all kinds of museums. And then they lead the charge for this idea of degenerate art and presenting it to the people as well.
Just to remind everyone, we're talking with Joan Clinefelter, a history professor at the University of Northern Colorado and an expert on Germany.
And soon to retire as a longtime history professor.
Yes. By the time this is broadcast, Joan, you will be retired, right?
I will.
I have to say that I'm sorry for your possible future students because you're just amazing in the way you discuss these issues. You bring everything to life.
Well, you have to realize that I am often teaching to students who expect to be bored, and I need to convert them all to understanding why history really matters.
Well, one reason history matters is our next topic, and that is, to what extent are there and are there not parallels between Hitler and now what Donald Trump is doing? We started off mentioning that, and as I've been listening to you, I have to say I find it more and more frightening because I hear a lot of parallels. Now, it's hard to know where to begin, but let's start by hearing what Donald Trump said in a campaign video last year, not long before the election. And this is about what he's going to do to universities.
While academics have been obsessed with indoctrinating America's youth, the time has come to reclaim our once great educational institutions from the radical left, and we will do that.
And by the way, we've edited this video to shorten it.
When I return to the White House, I will fire the radical left accreditors that have allowed our colleges to become dominated by Marxist maniacs and lunatics. We will then accept applications for new accreditors who will impose real standards on colleges once again and once and for all. These standards will include defending the American tradition and Western civilization, protecting free speech, eliminating wasteful administrative positions that drive up costs incredibly, removing all Marxist diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucrats. We are going to get this anti-American insanity out of our institutions once and for all.
Of course, I just want to insert after that, we know that Trump has attacked universities, suspended funding under the pretext of protecting Jewish students from anti-Semitism and so forth. I guess the question here, Joan, is Did Hitler do anything like that? Was any of his rhetoric similar?
So let me read you from the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. Okay, so this was at the start of the political purge, where around 1/5 of the academic staff at universities ended up being fired. The law read, officials who, on account of their past political activities, cannot guarantee that they have always acted wholeheartedly for the nation state should either be forced into retirement or let go from their jobs. Very, very similar. And approximately 2,000 to 3,000 of the university professors were purged from their positions by 1938.
Well, Trump hasn't purged professors yet, but he has been actively trying to rope some sort of control over them. And he's made headway, at least so far, at Columbia. Listen to this news clip. We've cut it a bit.
Columbia University gave in to a set of partial demands from the Trump administration on Friday. The school will implement new rules regarding how it supervises and oversees certain programs in order to restore crucial federal funding. The Trump administration pulling $400 million in research grants, among other funding from Columbia earlier this month. Part of the Ivy League's concessions include putting its Middle Eastern Studies department under new supervision, tightening demonstration restrictions, including...
I was really horrified. I was horrified by Columbia giving in, because if they gave in originally thinking that, well, we'll give in on this one thing and then Trump will leave us alone, that is not going to happen, because authoritarians, once you give in to them, they just keep demanding more and more and more so that they can have more of a complete takeover. And they want to have a test case that can really demonstrate and serve as a threat to other institutions and get them to fall into line. And the Nazis absolutely did this. It was called, they have a special German word for it called Gleichschaltung, which was coordination. And this is when institutions basically reformed themselves along the Nazi lines rather than wait for the Nazis to do it to them.
Well, that's familiar, isn't it?
It's very familiar.
You know, we should mention that the federal government does not control secondary school curricula, but not directly anyway. They're trying to manipulate it with funding leverage. But Florida and other states started rewriting the state's history books even before Trump got reelected president. For instance, Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, and his Republican legislature and his school board have been leading this campaign. They're trying to stamp out what they call woke history.
Right. Florida's history books are supposed to say that African Americans benefited from slavery, and the textbooks are supposed to cut out references to the Black Lives Matter movement and all kinds of other changes.
But let's go back to universities for a moment. We should stress that Trump is trying to force Harvard and other schools to make concessions now, but Harvard is fighting back.
And I think that pushing back is really important. I'm really glad that Harvard has sued the Trump administration for, among other things, violation of its freedom of speech. And I really don't want to believe that the Supreme Court will accept Trump's takeover of Harvard and the other universities. Harvard is pushing back, and universities have joined a joint statement pushing back against the attacks on the universities.
In fact, last I checked, hundreds of college and university presidents and other educational leaders have signed that statement.
You know, we do still have levers to pull to preserve our democracy. But I'm very worried about the Supreme Court. You know, will the Supreme Court uphold the right to free speech and the right to free thought? And I think that's right now one of my biggest concerns.
And meanwhile, Trump is also trying to purge the kinds of students he doesn't want at universities. Now, he's not doing it in the sweeping way that Hitler and the Nazis did, but there are echoes.
In the case of Harvard, he's threatened to deny visas to any foreign students who want to come to Harvard. And by the way, I don't know if many people know this, but by and large, international students pay full tuition when they come. So these are important sources of funding.
And the Trump administration has been deporting unknown numbers of students, apparently simply because they are thought to have participated in protests of some sort or written articles in the campus papers supporting the Palestinians. They're being accused of being Hamas supporters, which in cases that reporters have been able to track down does not appear to be at all accurate.
A line of protesters chanting in front of Somerville City Hall, outraged by the detention of a Tufts University student. As WBZ's Tammy Mutasa reports, the federal government says this is part of a nationwide crackdown.
She's whisked away like the gulag. It's sickening. Screaming in terror.
On Tuesday, federal agents detained the Turkish national on her Somerville Street.
We should add that after that student was arrested, civil liberties groups sued. A federal judge ruled that the Trump administration was breaking the law and that the Turkish student was recently freed after more than 6 weeks in jail.
But lots of other students have also been rounded up and detained, and in some cases deported. And I don't think any group has a reliable number of how many.
I suppose the relevant question here is, when we're talking about Nazi Germany, is whether the objective is to destroy universities as independent, self-governing institutions, which have zones of academic freedom and freedom of inquiry and speech and that sort of thing. Give us some sense of what the similarities and differences are in the Hitler and the Trump approaches.
Well, I think that Trump is hitting the universities from far more different angles than what was the case in Germany. Also, the German professorate tended to be really quite conservative as well, and to a large extent were more than willing to go along with this new sort of nationalistic line in terms of education. I will say that Trump's vision of what he thinks is going on at the universities bears no similarity to the reality that I live on a daily basis. We are not indoctrinating students at all. We are teaching them how to think and how to think critically and how to ask questions. And I think that's ultimately what they're afraid of, which is also what the Nazis were afraid of.
What does that mean exactly, to stifle critical thinking?
Well, one of the things that we talk about or have been talking about in history for a number of years is teaching students how to read original documents and to interpret the documents in a variety of different ways, right? I mean, one of the great things about doing history is you can give the same document to 5 different historians, and they'll all have a slightly different interpretation or a slightly different reading of the document. And that's what history does. It's this conversation with the past. And that's definitely something that authoritarians, and I think Trump, want to have stifled. They don't want people asking questions. They simply want people nodding along and saying, oh, so this is what happened in the past. I can study the past only to feel good about myself, and I don't need to think about how things in the past might have been better. I don't need to make connections between what was going on in the past and what's going on now. The Trump administration wants one dominant historical narrative, period. As I think kind of a warning bell, the Nazis destroyed the German universities. The German universities were the premier universities of the Western world, and many of the professors who were purged ended up leaving Germany altogether. And I think that if Trump succeeds, it would really have a huge impact on our university system and our education system overall. And I think another similarity that we could point to with Trump and his attacks on the universities, very similar to Viktor Orban in Hungary. The universities in Hungary are filled with political appointees. Authoritarians want to control education. They want to control the narrative of the past. And I think that Trump is definitely operating in that authoritarian vein.
Speaking of which, we talked earlier about how Hitler and the Nazis basically ordered people to denounce colleagues who they thought were not towing the Hitler line. Well, Trump's Department of Education has launched pretty much the same thing.
They've created a website where teachers, parents, and students can report anybody who they think is trying to promote DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can imagine the kind of atmosphere of informing that's going to create in classrooms.
That kind of thing really has a chilling effect in the classroom. Professors have to think very carefully about what they say. The issue really is that diversity, equity, and inclusion have been turned into these evil things. And all we're saying is that all students need to be treated equally. They all need to be respected. We need to have a diversity of viewpoints. And somehow that is now a problem.
Well, one of the other issues you talked about in terms of how the Nazis tried to educate, or maybe the word is brainwash, the German public, was not just their campaigns in schools, but also in museums and other kinds of institutions outside of the school system to change how Germans thought about their past and who they were. So I want to bring in now something that Trump has done about museums. In addition to attacking universities, he issued an executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. Quote, Americans have witnessed a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. This revisionist movement seeks to undermine the remarkable achievements of the United States by casting its founding principles and historical milestones in a negative light. Under the historical revision, our nation's unparalleled legacy of advancing liberty, individual rights, and human happiness is reconstructed as inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, or otherwise irredeemably flawed. And the executive order directs the vice president, who's a member of the Smithsonian's Board of Regents. And by the way, the Smithsonian is not just, a museum. It's many museums and many research centers. It directs him to work to eliminate, I'm quoting here, eliminate improper, divisive, or anti-American ideology from the Smithsonian and its museums, education, and research centers, et cetera, et cetera.
In 2021, J.D. Vance outlined the Republicans' plan to take over what he called hostile institutions who control what we call the truth.
So the idea of national unity is certainly woven very intricately through that executive order, Joan. So are there differences between what the Trumpists, I come to call them, Trumpists, are there differences between what they want and what Hitler wanted in terms of the way history is taught? Or are the similarities just so intense that you can't really draw distinctions?
Well, I think they are disturbingly similar by attacking how they want history to be taught in the schools, in museums like the Smithsonian, going after the African American Museum of History and Culture that's in Washington, D.C. It's not clear whether the Women's History Museum will ever be realized, which has been in the works for a number of years. I think that executive order that Daniel just read it would fit very well into Nazi Germany.
Wow.
Now, this is not to say that, Hitler and Trump are the same person, but I think they have the same ultimate goal, which is ideological purity, sort of a cultural cleansing of history, of culture, so that it only gives the message that they believe is appropriate, and getting rid of anybody who has any sort of dissenting point of view. I think the one real distinction is that the Nazis were all about race and promoting this idea of the pure German race and German racial superiority. And that's clearly something that's missing from Trump.
Can I argue with you? It seems to me, I feel very differently when I hear Trump. I think Trump and his supporters are constantly saying, get rid of all this emphasis on slavery. Change the histories to talk about the black workers. Don't talk about racial division. In fact, in a moment, I want to get to some of the terminology and talk about some of the words that the Trump administration has purged from federal agencies. And some of those words, which we'll hear in a moment, have to do very much with race and racism.
No, I see your point. I guess I'm looking for some sort of difference so that I can have a bright spot.
Well, it's, in a way, I mean, the Trump approach is a little going through the back door, I think, in a way. I mean, there's an implicit white supremacist overtone to it, but they're doing it by trying to deny the faults of American history in terms of minorities, particularly blacks, or at least play them down. I mean, your description of what Hitler was saying and what the Nazi history curriculum was doing was very clear and open and explicit. It was right up front. Trump's is a little less explicit, although I think the implications are very similar.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that.
One of the things that's been striking us is how Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump seem to use similar language. For example, Hitler in Mein Kampf, I think, described Jews as parasites, right, who had infected the healthy body of the German folk, right, the German people. Trump has talked a lot about, quote, tremendous infectious diseases pouring across the border. He's described immigrants as animals and infestations.
It's so bad, and people are coming in with disease. People are coming in with every possible thing that you can.
Poisoning of the blood. These are also terms that Hitler used as well.
They're destroying the blood of our country. That's what they're doing. They're destroying our country.
Hitler described Jews as rats.
Vermin.
We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
Enemies from within. These are also terms that Hitler used as well.
The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within.
It's Trump's rhetorical style that really points to similarities with Hitler. Trump paints the world as a set of friends and enemies, loyal supporters and evil, vile enemies of the people who are out to destroy national unity and identity. And that language, like vermin, rats, poisoning of the blood, really seeks to dehumanize the opponents so that they're not just people who disagree with Trump. They are less than human. And because they're less than human, well, the ultimate end of that, they need to be eradicated.
There was a really disturbing article in the New York Times not long ago, which listed dozens and dozens of words which either have been banned by the Trump administration throughout the agencies, or officials have told their staffs to use them very seldom. I'm only going to read a bunch of them because there's so many. Activism, anti-racism, anti-racist, biased, black, climate science, clean energy, DEI, of course, cultural differences, diverse, disabilities, equality, hate speech, feminism, immigrants, inequality, segregation, multicultural, minorities, pollution, prostitute. That's interesting. It wasn't Stormy Daniels kind of a...
Well, that's a reason not to include that word.
Social justice, underserved. This is among the dozens and dozens of words that have been...
And by the way, I know from talking to people in agencies and researchers that researchers are advised not to put words like that in their grant applications or their papers. They're not going to get them published. I mean, so, I know of a researcher who's doing... gender differences in, certain treatments, certain medical treatments. And, she's wondering, can she do this? Because the word gender is in there. How's she going to cope with it? It's really...
I mean, one of the most ridiculous things about this purging of language, one of the other words is the word gay. You may have heard that when they were purging the word gay, Enola Gay got caught up in this.
The plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
Right. And of course, there was a very, very contentious exhibition about the Enola Gay that Republicans and veterans groups actually ended up getting shut down because they didn't like the fact that the exhibition was, here are the pros of dropping the atomic bomb, here are the negatives of dropping the atomic bomb.
Critical thinking.
Critical thinking. What do you think?
Yeah, I happen to know the historian, Martin Sherwin, who wrote that plaque and was basically censored, and they didn't put it up in the end.
Yeah.
You know, there are so many issues we could talk about. We haven't talked about the Kennedy Center and how Trump has purged the Kennedy Center because it doesn't portray the kind of culture that he approves of. He signed a memorandum requiring federal buildings to reflect, and I'm quoting here, the timeless grandeur of traditional classical architecture. I mean, that sounds like Nazi Germany.
Oh, yeah. In fact, Hitler regarded himself as an architectural expert. The Nazis believed that they were the heirs to ancient Greeks and Romans, and that this classical architecture sort of harkened back to these sort of Aryan forefathers.
Well, Dave, I know you've been mulling over a question.
I have.
I think a lot of us have been wondering.
Yeah. So, Joan, you're the perfect person to ask this. I've been wondering how people made the decision in Germany or in Austria or Poland in the 30s to leave versus stay. Do you have any insight into what went on in people's minds that informed that decision?
And let me just add before you answer that as we speak, I'm in Vancouver, Canada. And a lot of people up here, Canadians, have been saying, semi-jokingly, we're hearing from our loved ones in the United States. They're asking, is there any chance we can get visas or residency so that we could move to Canada if we have to?
Yeah, so it was an absolutely heartrending decision because one had to give up, most of all, their language. The artists who fled, who I know the best, basically felt that they had no possibility for any kind of economic existence. And economics often was behind this move to leave. That was also true of Jews as well, because initially the Nazis wanted to force Jews to emigrate. And by 1938, Jewish businesses were being taken over. Aryanized was the term that was used. And increasingly, Jews were not allowed to practice certain professions. So the decision was really guided by economics. And also, the second major thing was the safety of their children. This is particularly true of Jews. In fact, 50% of German Jews emigrated before World War II broke out. Once the war breaks out, there's virtually no way to leave the country. And first and foremost, they wanted to get their children out. And if that meant separating the family, sending the children on their own, for example, to Britain, then they were willing to do that. And I think it's a sign of this real desperation that there is no future. That's what really drives somebody to leave their country, that there's simply no future left to be able to pursue if they remain in that country, and that they might be personally at risk as well.
The obvious next question is, what do you think would have to happen in the United States to make it, likely or possible or even, a good idea for people to leave the country?
Yeah, so a big part of me wants to say, don't leave, stay here and fight like hell.
Mm-hmm.
But, oh God, what would it take? My husband and I have basically talked about the idea, but not in any kind of serious sort of way. And I think in part that's because we are committed to trying to not let it go as far as Trump wants it to go. And I do think that there is still some hope. Yeah, it's a terrifying prospect. It is an absolutely terrifying prospect.
Well, this has been fascinating in the most troubling way. We've been talking to Joan Clinefelter, who is just retiring as a history professor at the University of Northern Colorado.
And Joan, we feel bad for the future students who aren't going to get to have you.
Well, that's very kind of you to say.
Joan, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.